Picture this. Milan, 1515, the year Leonardo da Vinci died, the year Martin Luther was about to nail his theses to that church door in Wittenberg. Europe was on the cusp of everything the Renaissance flowering, the Reformation brewing, empires clashing across Italian soil like titans wrestling over a garden. And in one particular hall in Milan, in one specific moment that would ripple across battlefields for generations, a young man was about to be laughed out of the room. The Armourers' Guild Hall wasn't just any meeting place. Think of it as the Pentagon of medieval craftsmanship, where the men who literally kept knights alive gathered to discuss the business of not dying. 50 master craftsmen filled the room that day, 50 men whose hammers had shaped the very steel that protected kings and emperors. These weren't just metal workers. These were the architects of survival, the engineers of warfare, the guardians of a tradition stretching back to the Romans. There, standing before them with something that looked like it belonged in a fishmonger's stall rather than on a battlefield, was Filippo Negroli. Now, Filippo wasn't some upstart nobody. His grandfather had forged armour for the Sforzas, the very family that had turned Milan into a powerhouse. His uncles crafted protection for the Pope's Swiss Guard, men who stood between the Vicar of Christ and anyone foolish enough to threaten him. The Negroli name meant something in the world of steel and fire, which makes what happened next all the more remarkable. Filippo held up what appeared to be metal fabric. I want you to imagine the moment this young craftsman, maybe 25 years old, lifting something that caught the light like water, that moved like silk, that seemed to flow between his fingers. The scales, and they were scales, each no thicker than 2 stacked coins, rippled as he moved them. The sound alone must have been extraordinary, like rain on leaves, like a whispered promise of something entirely new. The masters erupted. Not in applause, not in wonder, in laughter, deep, belly-shaking, contemptuous laughter that echoed off the stone walls and probably haunted Filippo's dreams for years afterward. These were men who understood armour the way a priest understands scripture, and what they were seeing looked like heresy made manifest. Giovanni delle Bande Nere rose from his chair. Now, this was a name that carried weight not just because he was the most respected armourer in Italy, but because he understood warfare from both sides of the hammer. He'd seen men live and die based on the quality of their protection. When Giovanni della Bande Nere spoke about armour, emperors listened. "Armour fit for dancers?" he declared, his voice cutting through the laughter like a blade through silk. "Not warriors." Think about the profound insult packed into those words. Dancing was for entertainment, for courtly frivolity, for peacetime pursuits when men could afford to be graceful instead of deadly. Warriors wore weight, warriors carried burden. Warriors accepted that protection meant sacrifice of speed, of grace, of the very humanity that made them vulnerable in the first place. But here's where it gets interesting. The mockery stung deeper than it might have with someone else, because Filippo wasn't just proposing a new design, he was proposing revolution. He was standing in that hall, surrounded by the accumulated wisdom of generations, and saying, "Everything you know is wrong." His heresy was elegant in its simplicity. Protection comes not from thickness, but from movement. Not from weight, but from wisdom. Not from resisting force, but from redirecting it. Picture Filippo walking home that night through Milan's narrow streets, the laughter still ringing in his ears, his revolutionary armour tucked under his arm like a shameful secret. But when he reached his workshop, now that's where the real story begins. The workshop was a shrine to obsession. Anatomical drawings covered every wall, detailed sketches that showed the human body in motion, every joint rotation, every muscle expansion, every point where traditional armour fought against the very thing it was supposed to protect. But these weren't just medical illustrations. Scattered among them were drawings of fish scales, serpent skin, the overlapping patterns that nature had perfected over millions of years. For 3 years, Filippo had been asking a question that no one else thought to ask. What if armour worked with the body instead of against it? Traditional armour was a fortress you wore. It protected you by making you into something other than human, slower, stronger, more like a walking castle than a man. But fortresses don't dance. They don't bend. They don't adapt. And in the rapidly changing world of Renaissance warfare, adaptation was becoming the difference between life and death. The economics were driving him too, and this is crucial to understand. One traditional suit of armor required 50 pounds of steel and 6 months of labor. 6 months, that's half a year of a master craftsman's life invested in protecting one knight. Filippo's design used 20 pounds and took 6 weeks. But here's the thing about efficiency in a guild system, it's not always welcome. Heavy armor meant steady work for miners digging iron ore, smelters turning ore into steel, apprentices learning the trade over decades. The entire medieval economy was built on the assumption that good things took time, that quality meant weight, that protection required sacrifice. Filippo's efficiency threatened all of that. As he worked through the night, and I picture him there, hammer in hand, the forge fire casting dancing shadows on those anatomical drawings, he was fighting more than metal. He was fighting tradition, economics, religion itself. Because armor wasn't just protection, it was theology, made steel. The heavier the burden, the greater the devotion. Knights who could barely walk under the weight of their armor were demonstrating their faith in God's protection, their willingness to sacrifice comfort for righteousness. Filippo's scales seemed almost pagan by comparison, inspired by fish and serpents rather than scripture and ceremony. But change was coming, whether the guild masters wanted it or not. Young nobles began visiting Filippo's workshop in secret second sons, mostly men who couldn't afford the traditional 6-month investment, knights who needed any advantage they could get in tournament or battle. And they brought news that made Filippo's hammer strikes more urgent with each passing hour. The French king was preparing for war in Italy. Soon, very soon, armor would be tested by more than ceremonial combat. Real steel would meet real flesh on real battlefields, and all the guild traditions in the world wouldn't stop a lance thrust or turn aside a sword blow. Filippo hammered through. Dawn. Each strike an answer to mockery. Each scale a small revolution taking shape. He couldn't have known then that his dancer's armor would reshape European warfare, that knights wearing his scales would dance through enemy formations like water through stone, that the very mobility the masters mocked would prove to be the future of survival itself. But perhaps, as the first light of morning touched his workshop windows and illuminated those anatomical drawings, those fish-scale patterns, those revolutionary pieces of metal that moved like living things, perhaps he sensed that he was forging more than armor. He was forging the future. And the future, as it turned out, belonged to those who could dance with death rather than simply endure it. The breakthrough came from the most unlikely place imaginable, a canal. Picture Filippo Negroli walking along the Naviglio Grande on a crisp morning in 1516, probably still stinging from the guild's mockery, when he stops dead, and in his tracks. There, in the murky water, carp are swimming. Not just swimming, flowing, moving with an efficiency that makes his engineer's mind race. Each fish scale slides over the others, protecting while flexing, creating armor that's both shield and silk. But here's the thing that separates genius from mere observation. Filippo doesn't just see the scales. He sees the problem they solve. Fish scales are uniform because fish are uniform. Human bodies are not. Every knight has different proportions, different muscle development, different ways of moving. You can't just copy nature, you have to understand it, then improve upon it. The workshop becomes something between a fortress and a laboratory. Filippo develops what might be the first truly scientific approach to armor making. He creates wooden mannequins with adjustable joints, recording angles and distances with mathematical precision that would make Euclid proud. This isn't the medieval approach of close enough and God will provide. This is Renaissance thinking: measure twice, cut once, and make every measurement count. His brothers Alessandro and Giovanni join the revolution, bringing metallurgy expertise that transforms everything. Together, they discover something that traditional armorers never bothered to investigate. Repeated folding and oil quenching create steel that's both thinner and stronger than anything the guild produces. It's not just about technique, it's about understanding metal at a level that borders on alchemy. Picture the first complete suit emerging after 7 months of failures. 7 months. Each failure taught them something new about stress points, about how the human body actually moves under combat conditions, about the difference between theoretical protection and real-world survival. Filippo's assistant, Pietro, volunteers to be the test subject, knowing that one flaw in the design means death or crippling injury. The courtyard demonstration that followed became legend. Surrounded by skeptical observers, probably including spies from rival workshops, Pietro performs movements that should be impossible in armor. He kneels smoothly, without the grinding, lurching motion of traditional plate. He mounts a horse unassisted, something that usually required a small crane or very patient squires. He rolls across the ground and rises in one fluid motion. Most stunning of all, he raises his arms fully overhead, something that traditional armor simply doesn't allow. And then he runs, actually runs, the scales singing like wind chimes, creating a sound that nobody had ever associated with armored movement before. Remember, knights in traditional armor don't run, they lumber. They advance with inexorable force but not speed. Pietro's run must have seemed like watching a man become something new, part human, part machine, but retaining all the grace of humanity while gaining the protection of steel. Word spreads through Milan's fighting brotherhoods, like wildfire in a dry forest. Young knights arrive at the workshop under cover of darkness, sworn to secrecy with oaths that would make confessional priests envious. Each one reports the same revelation. They can fight as they train, without the armor dictating their movements. The armor becomes an extension of their body rather than a cage containing it. But revolution never happens in a vacuum, and rivals are watching. Lorenzo Piccinino, master armorer to the Medicis, and we're talking about the Medicis here, the family that essentially owned Renaissance Florence, sends spies posing as apprentices. They report back with fragments of the truth, overlapping plates, oil treatments, mathematical patterns. But they're missing the crucial element that makes Filippo's system work. See, it's not one innovation. It's dozens of innovations working in perfect harmony. Filippo maps each scale's thickness to the specific body part it protects. Chest scales differ from arm scales, which differ from joint scales. The thickness varies not just by location, but by the individual knight's build and fighting style. It's customization at a level that the mass-production guild system simply can't match. Piccinino's attempts to copy the design produce armor that looks similar but fails catastrophically. During a demonstration in Florence, his version's scales jam together under stress, trapping the wearer like a lobster in its own shell. The knight has to be cut free, humiliated, and nearly suffocated. The failure only increases interest in Filippo's authentic design. Nothing sells innovation quite like watching the competition fail spectacularly. Now the economics get interesting, because Filippo faces the classic entrepreneur's dilemma: expand rapidly using apprentice labor or maintain quality through personal oversight. He chooses what we might call the Apple approach, training his brothers in the complete method while keeping final assembly under strict family control. Quality over quantity, but smart scaling. Their pricing strategy is masterful. They price below traditional guild rates, but well above their costs, making traditional armor seem overpriced while maintaining healthy profit margins. It's economic warfare disguised as fair competition. The guild threatens expulsion, which in medieval terms is basically a death sentence for any craftsman. But Filippo has been cultivating political connections with the precision of a master diplomat, a cardinal's nephew, alive because the armor's flexibility saved him during a riding accident, provides political protection. When the church backs you in Renaissance Italy, guild threats become irrelevant. By 1523, 8 years after that humiliating guild meeting, the workshop produces 12 suits monthly. Traditional armorers watch their orders drop by half. The very masters who mocked Filippo's dancer's armor now send their own sons as apprentices, hoping to learn the secrets they once dismissed. But the real test was coming. All the workshop demonstrations and political maneuvering in the world couldn't compare to what was approaching: actual warfare. The French king wasn't just preparing for war in Italy. He was bringing the largest, most professional army Europe had seen in generations. Traditional tactics, traditional armor, traditional thinking, were about to meet the future on a muddy field outside an Italian city called Pavia. And when steel met steel, when theory met reality, when revolution faced tradition in mortal combat, the world would discover whether Filippo Negroli was a genius or just another dreamer whose beautiful ideas would shatter against the brutal truth of war. February 24th, 1525. Dawn mist rises from the Ticino River like the breath of ghosts, and two armies face each other across a field that's about to become the graveyard of medieval warfare. This isn't just any battle. This is Pavia, the collision that will reshape European military thinking for the next 3 centuries. On one side, King Francis I of France leads what might be the most magnificent army ever assembled. 30,000 men, including the finest knights in Christendom, wearing armour that represents 800 years of metallurgical tradition. Armour so heavy, so magnificent, so thoroughly medieval that it literally glitters in the morning light. On the other side, the imperial forces seem almost shabby by comparison, but among them, something new catches that same morning light. 200 knights wearing armour that looks like fish scales, that sounds like wind chimes, that moves like water. The test has arrived. King Francis himself embodies everything that's about to die on this field. His armour weighs 80 pounds. 80 pounds. Of the finest steel Milan's traditional guilds could produce. His horse is already labouring under the burden, and the battle hasn't even begun. He's magnificent, terrible, and completely obsolete. The imperial commanders, many of them Spanish veterans who've learned to think differently about warfare, have trained their scaled knights in tactics that would seem impossible to medieval minds, quick strikes and withdrawals. Using mobility as a weapon rather than simply enduring enemy attacks, fighting like humans enhanced by technology rather than humans replaced by it. When the cannons roar and the arquebuses crack, and yes, gunpowder is already changing everything, making all armour somewhat obsolete, the battle becomes a test of military philosophy as much as military strength. The killing ground turns into a laboratory written in blood and mud. Picture the scene. February rain mixing with blood, creating a slurry that sucks at the feet of heavily armoured knights while barely slowing down their more mobile opponents. French knights, magnificent in their traditional plate, find themselves mired like dinosaurs in tar pits. They can advance, slowly and inexorably, but they can't retreat, can't manoeuvre, can't adapt to changing circumstances. Meanwhile, the scaled knights flow around them like water around stones. One scene crystallizes the entire revolution. Charles de Lannoy, wearing Negroli scales, faces a French knight whose lance thrust would normally end the encounter one way or another. Traditional thinking says stand firm, absorb the impact, rely on superior armour to survive. Instead, de Lannoy actually rolls under the lance thrust, rises behind his opponent like some Renaissance ninja, and strikes through the armpit gap with a precision that requires not just skill but flexibility no traditional armour allows. The French knight never sees it coming because it's not supposed to be possible. King Francis himself provides the most poignant symbol of the day's meaning. Surrounded, exhausted, his magnificent armour becomes his prison. He cannot raise his arms high enough to surrender properly. The very protection that was supposed to preserve his dignity becomes the instrument of his humiliation. When they finally cut him free, it takes 6 men and 20 minutes. The numbers tell the story with brutal clarity. 8,000 French dead, their armour-trapped bodies carpeting a field that had been farmland that morning. The imperial losses, 1,500, mostly unarmoured infantry who died to gunfire rather than close combat. But numbers don't capture the psychological impact. French survivors describe the horror of facing enemies who could move freely while they struggled in steel coffins. Some develop what we might recognize as battle trauma, clawing at their own armour even weeks later, terrorized by the memory of being trapped inside protection that had become imprisonment. News of Pavia spreads across Europe within weeks, carried by merchants, diplomats, and most importantly, by the survivors themselves. In Milan, the same masters who had mocked Filippo's dancer's armour now crowd his workshop like pilgrims seeking miracles. Giovanni delle Bandiere, the man who had dismissed the scales as armour fit for dancers, publicly retracts his mockery and commissions a suit for himself. The vindication is sweet, but the sweetest moment comes from captured French nobles. During their captivity, they're interviewed about the battle, and their descriptions of watching scaled knights flow through their formations like water through stone become the stuff of military legend. They use words like supernatural and impossible, not because they're prone to exaggeration, but because they've witnessed something that challenges everything they thought they knew about warfare. Orders flood in from across Europe. English earls who've heard rumours, German princes who've read reports, Spanish grandees who want whatever gave their imperial allies such devastating advantage. The Pope himself commissions armour for his personal guard if it's good enough to defeat the most Christian. King of France, it's certainly good enough to protect the Vicar of Christ. Filippo's workshop expands into 3 buildings, employing 40 craftsmen, all sworn to secrecy with bonds worth a year's wages. The revolution is no longer a family secret, it's becoming an industry. But victory comes with its own burdens. Traditional armourers attempt desperate innovations, creating articulated joints and thinner plates, trying to copy Filippo's advantage without understanding his philosophy. The results are predictably catastrophic. Several knights die testing inferior copies, crushed by their own compromised protection. Half measures in armour design aren't just ineffective, they're lethal. The revolution cannot be stopped by imitation, only by understanding. And understanding, as Filippo learned during those long nights studying fish scales and anatomical drawings, requires admitting that everything you thought you knew might be wrong. Pavia proved that the future belonged not to the ply, strongest or the most traditional, but to the most adaptable. The age of the walking fortress was ending. The age of the armoured dancer had begun. As Filippo Negroli ages into his 50s, watching his revolutionary armour transform not just individual knights but the entire nature of European warfare, he witnesses something remarkable, his innovation rippling outward like stones thrown into still water, changing things he never intended to change. By 1540, military theorists across Europe are writing treatises on mobility-based combat. These aren't just technical manuals, they're philosophical revolutions. Cavalry tactics evolve from the crushing charge, that quintessentially medieval concept of overwhelming force applied at a single point, to fluid manoeuvres that would look familiar to modern military strategists. The very idea of what it means to be a warrior is being rewritten. Infantry commanders, suddenly facing opponents who can climb ladders in full armour and fight, effectively on siege walls, develop new pike formations and defensive strategies. The old certainties that heavy cavalry charges are unstoppable, that armour means slow, that protection requires sacrifice, crumble like ancient fortifications under Renaissance cannons. Campaign seasons extend dramatically. Armies that can move 30% faster than their predecessors can operate deeper into enemy territory, stay in the field longer before winter forces retreat, strike where they were never expected. Maps of Europe begin showing the influence. Battles fought in places previously unreachable, borders shifting as mobility changes the very concept of strategic possibility. But the transformation runs deeper than military strategy. Something profound is happening to the culture itself. Noble portraits begin featuring scaled armour not just as protection, but as symbols of enlightenment. The old imagery knights as immovable objects, human fortresses, walking symbols of divine authority gives way to something more dynamic. Poets compose verses about knights who dance with death, capturing a new ideal of nobility that combines strength with grace, protection with flexibility. The Negroli workshop becomes a pilgrimage site for artists and engineers. Leonardo's students study the scale patterns, finding mathematical principles that apply far beyond armor making. Architects begin incorporating overlapping designs into roof systems, creating buildings that shed rain and snow more efficiently. The innovation jumps from metallurgy to engineering to pure mathematics, demonstrating how military necessity often drives civilian advancement. Religious art reflects the change too. Traditional depictions of divine protection showed saints and angels in rigid, fortress-like armor. New paintings feature scaled protection that seems to flow like fabric, representing divine grace through harmony rather than brute resistance. The theological implications are subtle, but profound. Perhaps God's protection works with human nature rather than against it. Women of noble houses report something unprecedented: relationships with husbands who can embrace them while wearing armor, who can dance at celebrations without removing their protection, who can play with children without the clunking, grinding restriction of traditional plate. The human body, freed from steel prisons, can express affection even in warlike times. Yet irony shadows every triumph, because history never stops moving. As Filippo trains his nephews in the family methods during the late 1540s, early firearms are improving with frightening speed. Spanish tercios demonstrate that concentrated musket fire can defeat any armor, scaled or traditional. The Swiss, those masters of pike warfare, develop tactics that make all heavy cavalry obsolete, regardless of how mobile it might be. The masters who had once fought Filippo's innovation now find themselves joining him in a different kind of obsolescence. The future belongs not to better armor, but to no armor at all. Gunpowder is the great equalizer, making a peasant with an arquebus more dangerous than a knight with decades of training and the finest protection money can buy. But Filippo adapts again, demonstrating the same innovative thinking that revolutionized battlefield protection. He transitions from functional armor to pure art, creating pieces that are sculptural masterworks rather than military equipment. His final helmets are shaped like ancient heroes, his breastplates engraved with mythological scenes that transform protection into storytelling. Museums, not battlefields, become the destiny of his greatest works. His workshop continues producing ceremonial pieces for coronations and parades, beauty outlasting utility in the way that great art always does. The scales that once saved lives become symbols of human ingenuity, triumphing over tradition, flexibility, conquering rigidity, mind defeating mere metal. Death comes peacefully in December 1551. Filippo dies in his own bed, surrounded by examples of his art and letters from knights whose lives his innovation had saved across 3 decades of European warfare. The funeral procession through Milan becomes a testament to transformation. Nobles from across Europe march in scaled armor, the sound like rain on leaves, a gentle percussion that speaks of revolution made manifest. The guild that had once mocked his dancer's armor carries his coffin, their charter amended to honor Master Filippo, who showed that true strength bends but does not break. It's a remarkable epitaph for a man who challenged everything his profession held sacred. His sons continue the workshop, but they're custodians of history rather than creators of military advantage. Within 50 years, guns make all personal armor ceremonial rather than functional. The age of armored combat that had lasted nearly a millennium ends not with a bang, but with the quiet clicking of triggers and the smoke of powder charges. Yet, in noble halls across Europe, Negroli armor stands in places of honor not as protection, but as proof that innovation, no matter how thoroughly mocked and systematically resisted, ultimately reshapes the world. The scales that had once flowed like water through enemy formations become symbols of something larger. The human capacity to see beyond accepted wisdom, to question fundamental assumptions, to prove that the impossible is merely the untried. Think about what Filippo accomplished. He took a technology that had remained essentially unchanged for centuries and revolutionized it by asking one simple question. What if we're doing this wrong? He faced mockery, economic pressure, and institutional resistance, yet persisted because he understood something his contemporaries missed. The future belonged not to those who could carry the heaviest burden, but to those who could dance with death, itself flexible, responsive, adaptive. In the end, that might be the most important lesson of all. That survival comes not from resisting change, but from embracing it, not from standing firm against the future, but from flowing toward it like scales in the wind. The revolution was complete. The dancer had taught the world to dance,